Hello and welcome to You'll Have to Dumb This Down for Me. I'm your host, Mikey.
And I'm also kind of your host, Kevin.
And today we're talking about Titanic.
Yeah, so we're going to have a chat about that little known ship, the RMS Titanic. And probably the most famous ship ever.
I would say so, yeah.
Yeah, definitely the most famous iceberg ever.
Yeah, I suppose.
Yeah. So probably the most famous boat and probably one of the most famous disasters ever as well. Shaped a lot of what people think about sinking boats and lifeboats and all that.
Absolutely, yeah.
We'll get into it. What do you know about this? I mean, I think everyone knows the basic outline of this story.
The basic outline of Titanic. So I am actually a massive Titanic fan, the movie and the boat itself. However, my mind is just a big sieve. So I do know the guts of what actually happened, but I just don't know. I can never remember the ins and outs.
Yeah, so it's a simple story, and it's also kind of a more intricate story. So spoiler alert for anyone who doesn't know, it's not going to end well for the Titanic. So just if you are one of those one in a trillion,
I didn't know that.
You only got halfway through the movie. So Titanic, it was the second of three Olympic class liners built by a company called White Star Line, and it was the largest ship on Earth when it was launched. White Star Line were competing with another company called Cunard, who built the Mauretania and the Lusitania, which were both very, very fast. And White Star Line realised that rather than competing with them for speed, they would compete on luxury and comfort instead. The chairman of White Star Line at this time was Bruce Ismay, and we will be chatting about him later.
Yeah.
He's a key figure in all this. The ships were just fast enough to operate on a weekly service. It was built by Harland and Wolff in Belfast, and it and its sister, the Olympic, between them cost £3 million to build, which in today's money is about 370 million pounds sterling. It took 4 years to build. It was 882 feet and 9 inches long, and it displaced 52,000 tonnes of water. It had a total passenger capacity of 2,453, and then with a full complement of crew, at full capacity, there'd be 3,457 people.
So nearly 1,000 crew.
Nearly 1,000 crew, yeah.
Wow.
An absolute behemoth. And again, we're going to reference the James Cameron film from 1997 a lot. Anyone who's seen that film will know it was built to like an incredible spec. Like it's a floating hotel. It's got the first class accommodation is outrageous. Yeah. It was luxury beyond all else. I think a ticket on it would cost the equivalent of about €100,000 in today's money.
Jesus, I didn't know that now.
Yeah, but even what's often not mentioned, the third class accommodation down in steerage compared to other ships, was actually reportedly very comfortable as well. Good food,
Yeah, I believe that the third class accommodation was nearly better than a lot of first class accommodations in regular immigration ships, or migration ships, as opposed to, because I think people think that this was a cruise ship, but it was actually just a migration ship.
Correct, yeah. People didn't go on this in general for a holiday. This was a ship that was, exactly, taking people to America to set up a new life, and Canada as well if they couldn't get into America. Plan B. So the main aspect of the design, aside from all the luxury from a safety point of view, is its watertight compartments and how they're aligned and so on. Now, we'll get into a lot more detail in this later, but I think the key thing from all this is that this ship, although it was never advertised as such, a lot of people held the belief that this ship was unsinkable. And that, I think, was kind of the prevailing opinion amongst some people. And I think that might explain the behaviours of some people going forward. So she's being built, and her maiden voyage is set for the 10th of April, 1912. Now, the UK is amidst a coal strike, so to even get enough coal to get her across the Atlantic, they've had to siphon coal from the nearby White Star ships to fill her up. They appoint their most senior captain. Captain Edward Smith is appointed, and there's 885 crew members. Now, again, another thing that's worth bearing in mind, the vast majority of these are not sailors or seamen. They are casual workers from Southampton. They've signed on that week or that month to work. There is obviously a good few sailors on board as well, and there's some specialised people for various things. She's just over half full. Because of the coal strike, a lot of people have kind of postponed travel across, business people, stuff like that. So she's only got 1,317 passengers on board, 24 in first class, 284 in second, and 709 in third. like there's a massive list. If you go on the Wikipedia page or anything of this, you'll be hit with a massive list of some of the probably the best known and wealthiest people on earth, certainly in the Western world, are on the boat. I mean, like John Jacob Astor is the wealthiest man on the boat. You've also got Benjamin Guggenheim. You've got Isidor Straus, who founded Macy's. Just a few.
That's like the equivalent of Jeff Bezos, sort of billionaire status.
Exactly. It's like if Jeff Bezos and Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and people
were all in one boat.
All in one boat. JP Morgan, who was supposed to go but cancelled late on, doesn't go. He's kind of the ultimate owner of the ship. He's the guy who owns the bank that's funded this. Yeah. Now, the exact number on board is not known. I mean, the numbers I've given you are estimates because people cancel, people don't show up, tickets are transferred. So we're not entirely sure. These are best estimates.
Yeah.
So on the day, the ship leaves Southampton at noon and almost immediately has an accident, or nearly has an accident. And because she's so big, Titanic is creating a bow wave unlike anything that they've ever seen before. And there's a ship nearby called the New York, and its cables snap. It comes free. It kind of starts to float into Titanic's way. And a nearby tugboat, I think called a Vulcan, reacts very quickly and gets between the two ships and stops it. So the Titanic does not reach New York, which is kind of maybe a foreboding type of thing. So she heads out, she heads to Cherbourg, she picks up passengers there, and then she comes to Queenstown in Cork, it's now called Cove. And by 11:30 the next day, it's when she really starts to get going on her journey. Hugs the Irish coast for a bit until Fastnet Lighthouse, which is often called Ireland's teardrop, because it's the last thing anyone would see before they left Ireland.
Oh, never knew that.
So a lot of people who'd have left in the time when they knew they'd never come back, that was the last thing they'd ever see of Ireland. It's called Ireland's teardrop. Very Ireland-centric fact there for listeners.
Very sad there.
Yeah. Well, it's going to cheer up very soon. And she heads out roughly in a kind of a southwest direction towards New York. So for the first few days, the crossing is very uneventful. She's making good time. There is this kind of, it's become a kind of a conspiracy theory, urban legend. There is a fire in the coal bunker, but it's under control. And that's actually, believe it or not, very normal.
Yeah.
Coal bunkers. Coal at high temperatures does spontaneously combust.
What?
Yeah, if you put in high temperatures, and there's towns in America that are permanently on fire because of coal underneath. Like it's one of those things. So it's kind of one of the things you just manage it as it goes. I know it's crazy.
Oh God. Anyway,
so she's heading out, and the weather is kind of mild, and it's a little bit windy. And then on the 13th of April, Titanic hits a cold weather front, and it's really wet and windy for a few hours. She's riding biggish waves. And then on April 14th, she clears that. And then she gets into what I think is probably the key thing to remember in all this. She gets into some very outright weird weather for the time period.
Yeah.
So she cleared the cold front, and now what's happening is the sea is calm. And like, if you've seen the movie, or there was an old movie called The Night to Remember as well, like the sea is almost like glass. We live in a northern Atlantic island. That is very unusual for the Atlantic. It's freakishly unusual. Like people on that day were saying they'd almost forget they were on a ship.
It's just that smooth.
It's just that smooth, that calm. It's like being on a hotel. And what's also happening, and people are starting to notice, and this is what's ultimately going to become so fatal in this, it's starting to become very, very cold.
Yeah.
Because even though the ship is kind of slightly heading south, which usually in the Northern Hemisphere, if you're going south, it's going to get warmer.
Yeah.
Because of the Gulf Stream, even though New York and Newfoundland are actually further south of Ireland, they're much, much colder in the winter. So this calmness and coldness is constructing a scenario which will make icebergs very, very difficult to spot. Obviously, during the day, it's not an issue. But at night, usually icebergs are spotted by water breaking against them. There'll be some white water. There'll be some sound. Yeah. Icebergs are now floating silently. It's also true that the winter had been very, very mild. And paradoxically, a mild winter means more ice because it's melted in Greenland and places.
It's breaking off.
It's breaking off. Bigger chunks of ice are breaking off. Now, the Titanic is not blind to this. It's received at least 6 warnings about ice on the radio. And obviously, we don't know for certain, but we reckon at least 3 of these are given to Captain Smith. And he does nothing about them. He continues at full speed. Now, obviously, in hindsight, this looks terrible. But that was standard practice at the time. And, you have to remember, Captain Smith is he does think he's in an unsinkable ship,
And wasn't he one of the best captains out there?
Well, we'll come to that.
Okay.
So there is there is a lot of disagreement about his behaviour or his kind of competence.
Yeah.
So these ice warnings have come through on the radio, and this is a good point to touch on what's actually going on in the radio. So radio, the Morse code radio, it is very new technology at this point. And the people in there are not actually employees of White Star Line. They are employees of Marconi, the company that owned the radio.
Yeah.
And their primary job is to send passengers messages.
Yeah, this was basically sending letters from home.
Yeah.
And kind of relaying messages back home.
And a lot of it is almost the Instagram of its day, kind of OMG, I'm on Titanic. Because, this is a novelty to them. They've never been able to send messages.
Yeah.
So these lads are not, bursting down the door going, Jesus, there's ice ahead to Captain Smith. They are when they get a chance. Oh, by the way, we got an ice warning. So, they're not their top priority.
Yeah.
They are trying to clear ahead. So anyway, we're at the night of the sinking, and Smith has gone to bed. He's left the order. We're going to continue at full speed. Keep watch. The ship is in the hands of First Officer William Murdoch, very experienced seaman. Now, at 11:30, the lookouts in the crow's nest, they see a mirage up ahead, but they think no more about it. Now, this is still a kind of point of debate because it's so cold. It's like being in hot weather when you look out into a desert.
Yeah.
You get a mirage on the horizon. It does make things harder to spot. It's still debated if this is a mirage or if it's actually
the iceberg.
But they do know more about it. However, 9 minutes later, at 11:39, Frederick Fleet in the crow's nest, he spots a massive iceberg directly in their path. He rings the bell 3 times and phones down to let the bridge know. Murdoch, by this time, has also spotted the iceberg, and he takes some evasive action. And this is, I think, one of the big debating points of the whole thing. A lot of people, in retrospect, say that if Murdoch had done nothing, perhaps just slowed down and hit the iceberg full on, Titanic would likely have survived. There had been a German ship actually suffered something very similar and actually just continued on with its journey. But obviously, this goes against his instinct as a seaman. It's very hard to just ram it.
If you have a brick wall in front of you and you have an option to swerve, you're going to swerve.
Exactly. Yeah. And, he obviously thinks, I can avoid any collision, So he orders hard a starboard, which turns the ship to the left. These are all tiller commands. So if you, on a boat with a tiller rather than a wheel, if you push it left, the ship turns right.
Yes.
So that's because it's being steered by a rudder. So even though Titanic is with a wheel, the ship starts to turn and he puts the engines in reverse. Ship starts to turn very, very slowly as it's a massive ship. And Murdoch then orders hard a port. What he's doing is he's trying to, because the ship has been steered from the back, I don't know if you've ever driven a forklift, you can kind of swing the back of it.
Yeah, he kind of almost wants a power slide around it.
Almost, yeah. It's kind of like a power slide, yeah. It's called a port around maneuver. And he's trying to swing around and avoid the iceberg. Now, ultimate spoiler alert, this doesn't work. The ship hits the iceberg, a kind of a glancing blow under the waterline. It doesn't tear a gash in the ship, as some people say. What it does is, the ship is built by kind of plates of iron, and there's got rivets holding them. It bends plates where it hits. That pops the rivets, creates a gap under the waterline.
Yeah. And
water rushes in. So immediately very little happens. Above the waterline, it's barely noticed. People in first class kind of feel a little shudder, or some people compare it to running over marbles.
Yeah.
Now lower down it is felt a lot more, and it actually feels like a collision. So Murdoch orders the engine stop, orders the watertight doors closed, engine shut off. Cold water starts to rush in, and as it hits the coal, it boils, and it kind of causes this very loud screaming noise because they've got to let steam out. You don't want too much cold water on hot coal or it'll explode.
Absolutely, yeah.
So they're funneling it up. So Captain Smith is woken up by all this, and he and the ship's designer, Thomas Andrews, they go on a quick tour of the ship to survey the damage. And based on that survey, they notice that the first 5 of Titanic's watertight compartments are flooded. And I think this is a good point to mention how these watertight compartments work. So there are 16 of them. They are watertight, but they're not sealed at the top. So I think the best way to get your head around this is, the ice tray you'd have in your freezer. Of the 16, the first 4 can flood, or any 2 side compartments can flood, and the ship will stay afloat.
Yeah.
However, if more than 4 flood, flood, it will tip. And then, like your ice tray, if you push it if you have it, say, in a sink of water, you push it down, water will start flooding over the top, back and forth
Exactly,
as it
there's
tips.
no lid.
Yeah, exactly. There's no lid. And, in a way, this is tragic because, well, obviously tragic, but this is a really well-built ship, and it can take a head-on collision with an iceberg or a side-on collision. Because when you're building a ship, you think, there's only two types of accidents we can have. We can hit something, or something can hit us.
You don't expect to be...
It's had the one unlikely type of accident that can sink it has happened immediately. So Andrews notices this, and he, doesn't mince his words. He says to Captain Smith, the ship is going to sink. And he says an hour and a half, 2 at most. It's in the film brilliantly. He says how the water's going to rush back and forth. So we're at midnight now. At 12:05, Smith orders the passengers to be mustered and for the lifeboats to be prepared. Now, Sunday morning, there was supposed to be a lifeboat drill, but for reasons unknown, it was cancelled. So, for vast majority of men on this boat, they have never lowered a lifeboat.
God.
Okay. Now, I don't know why it was cancelled. There's some talk that it was almost like they were nearly always cancelled, that people hated them. And again, you have to bear in mind, these lads thought, why are we practicing?
Yeah.
The ship can't sink. So the biggest ship ever built is now going to be abandoned by lads who have no idea how to abandon it. By 12:20, the lifeboats are beginning to be filled, and I think it's probably fair to say, of all the controversial issues on the Titanics, the lifeboats and how they're filled and how many of them there are, it's the most controversial issue.
Absolutely.
It's famous, that there was not enough lifeboats for people on board.
But they could fit, wasn't it, 85 people or something like that on a lifeboat or something?
68 on
68,
average.
that's what it was, yeah.
So Smith puts Murdoch in charge of the starboard side, and Lightholler, Charles Lightholler, the second officer, in charge of the port side. They're the two most senior officers, junior to Captain Smith. So the lifeboats. Titanic had 20 lifeboats. It had 16 regular ones and 4 collapsible ones.
What does collapsible mean?
They're kind of flat. They're almost like flat pack lifeboats. The sides can be brought up on them.
Almost like canvas or something.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. They're stored away flat for easy.
Okay.
So they could take 68 passengers each on average, meaning that there is enough for about half the people on board. Now, this is obviously seen as horrible and again, in hindsight it is, but Titanic actually had more lifeboats than it was legally required to have.
That's one thing I read up on, and of its day, it was seen as too much.
Yeah.
Because like that, they thought the ship was unsinkable. And second of all, it was unsightly to have them on the...
It was unsightly. And there's another thing. Usually in an accident, getting on a lifeboat is often more dangerous than it appears. Ships often list to one side, which means that only one side of the lifeboat can be lowered down. And what are the lifeboats? Lifeboats are tiny wooden boats in the middle of the Atlantic.
Yeah.
So what they're kind of designed for is they're hoping that another ship will come and rescue, and lifeboats will ferry people back and forth.
Yeah.
And that lifeboats will be used multi times. Another very controversial issue with the lifeboats is they're not all full. Murdoch and Lightholler are filling them, and they lower ones. I mean, there's some ones famously only have 12, 24. Now, this again, in hindsight, looks terrible. But you have to remember, Murdoch and Lightholler know. They are two of the men on board who have done this before. And they know they don't have all day.
Yeah.
So if they have 12 people on a lifeboat and people aren't getting on it, they're just going to say, F it, lower it, we'll get the next one. They can't be waiting for people to fill.
I also think, maybe in hindsight and 2020 and everything like that, it's easy to say now, but if you're on the most high-tech, expensive boat that has ever been made, and the main thing about this boat is that it's unsinkable, and you're being told to get on a lifeboat, you might actually be hesitant to.
Absolutely. That is a massive issue. People are inside, they're warm, they're comfortable. The ship isn't really tilting much. It has a slight list, but, there's no signs that the ship is doomed to a layman. Yeah. And you're being told to go up into a little wooden boat and be lowered, I think it's 11 stories high in the dark. And there's kind of like a trope that it's wealthy people who are reluctant. Often it's actually the poorer people who are reluctant to get on the lifeboat because everything they own is in the Titanic. They brought it with them.
Yeah.
It means leaving, a wealthy person is leaving some of their wealth, but they're still going to be wealthy when it's over.
Yeah.
A lot of the poor people on board are leaving everything they own. They're very reluctant to do so.
I think also, wasn't it a thing, because obviously lifeboats were, wooden and everything, they weren't sure if they could actually take the weight of, say, 60 to whatever people.
There is an element to that as well, yeah. And again, they haven't drilled, so they haven't practiced, they don't know. So now our next lifeboat related controversy is how they're actually being filled. So Smith has given the very standard order at the time, women and children first. But he hasn't given any further clarification, and Lightoller and Murdoch have taken this very different ways. Murdoch on his side has taken it very literally. He means women and children first, but then if any men are nearby and I have vacant seats, I'll put them on. Lightoller, on the other side, he takes this to mean women and children only. Now, this sounds, again, horrible in hindsight, but he is paranoid that there's going to be a storming of the boats, that people are going to panic. And he knows if I can't release boats, nobody survives.
You can see both sides.
You can absolutely see both sides. Now, it's undoubted that Lightoller's strictness, probably condemned people to death, but he had to get on his job, and we'll get on to Lightoller. Lightoller has one of the most mental stories of anyone here. He's the most senior man that will survive Titanic. And, it does look bad as well because there wasn't a panic on Murdoch's side.
Yeah.
So it does. Now, Lightoller will survive this in a crazy way, and he actually goes on to become one of the heroes of the Dunkirk evacuation in World War II.
No way.
Yeah, he has a, so it's obvious that the man is quite, he knows what he's doing. But yeah, he's very strict. And there is some horrific stories. You'll honestly start crying hearing about some of the stories of husbands being separated from their wives, and Lightoller is saying absolutely no. So they're filling away the boats. Now, while this is going on, there are other efforts being made to save the ship. The wireless operators are frantically trying to hail other ships. They do get a response. One ship, the Carpathia, answers, and it starts barreling towards the Titanic. Through an ice field itself, quite a brave thing, but they're too far away. They won't get there for 4 hours. However, there's a ship much, much closer. The Californian is actually within sight of Titanic. It's about 10 or 12 miles away.
God.
And her radar officer, Cyril Evans, has turned off his radio 10 minutes before the iceberg hit.
Which was common at the time, I believe.
Very common. He basically was doing a body of work. Again, he's not working for the ship, he's working for the wireless company. And he had actually been transmitting because of the way they transmit messages all the way to, I think they're going to Cape something in Newfoundland, I forget. But they're all going to one way. Titanic has actually told him to shut up because Titanic is clearing a backlog of messages of wealthy people. So he has turned off his wireless 10 minutes before the Titanic hits the iceberg. Now, it does see the flares Titanic fire, and it's highly controversial. The captain of that ship, Stanley Lord, he dismisses them as, they're not the right flares, it can't be distress. And there is people on the Californian saying, sorry, they wouldn't fire rockets at this hour of night for nothing. They did try and contact the Titanic by Morse lamp, but they got no answer.
Wow. I never knew that.
Yeah. So, now, again, it's hugely up for debate whether they could have done anything, but they would definitely have been there quicker than the Carpathia. So anyway, we're up to about 12:30. There's flares being shot, and it's more and more people now are becoming clear that this is not, a minor incident. As I say, there's families getting separated. Down in the bowels of the ship, famously in the film, there's some third-class passengers who are trying to make their way up and are being met with locked gates. Now, this is often portrayed as kind of
a classist.
Yeah, a class hatred, screw the poor, But that's actually not the case. US immigration requires them gates to be locked. Third-class passengers get off at a different part of the first and second class are going to get off in Manhattan. Third class get off in Ellis Island. They have to be inspected. Diseases, lice, stuff like that. They're trying to contain them. Now, there is some delay in opening the gates, but I think more and more people now looking back on it say this is more a delay of people just being, if you'll pardon the pun, flooded with work than actually having those people and quite a lot of third class passengers survive.
But this, I thought about this recently enough. My day-to-day job is quite important, and me and Kev work together in a very important role. If I was asked to do something like this and had to think about opening a certain gate for certain people to come up while thinking about getting people up, stairs to safety while thinking of 100 million different things. And this is just your regular day-to-day job. I know they should have like trained for that, but it's an awful lot of pressure and an awful lot of responsibility to put on like that a regular casual worker.
Yeah, casual worker. Yeah, it's it is a lot to do, and you can see why people. There's very definitely panic. There's also a lot of people in steerage, in particular, who don't speak English. There's a lot of people from Croatia, from Romania, from Russia, from China, who are, it's actually one of the things Irish people in steerage survive at a higher rate because we can speak English.
Yeah.
And communicate. Anyway, so it's going on. The lifeboats are being released. By about 1:30, we're really into panic stations, and officers had to fire shots in the air to keep people off the boat. Every boat is being launched absolutely full. There's a couple being launched even more full than they should be. By 20:50, the 16 regular boats are gone. We're down to the collapsibles. Now, one survivor on these collapsibles is going to prove very, very controversial, and that is the head of White Star Line, Bruce Ismay.
Yeah.
Now, if you've watched the film, he is portrayed as this money-hungry coward. That's how he seems to have been received for the rest of his life. Now, Bruce Ismay, for most of the sinking, is running up and down, trying to get people on boats.
Yeah.
He's come down to the last couple of collapsibles. There is no one else around. There are 6 empty seats in the collapsible, and there's no one else around. He doesn't take the seat of anyone. Murdoch tells him to get in, but he is plagued with survivor's guilt after this. It destroys his life. So he doesn't take a ship.
Well, I think it's an incredibly hard decision to make, to see certain death right beside you, or there's a free seat for survival. You're obviously going to pick.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's very cruel to kind of see it. It's the time. There's not a lot of stiff upper lip kind of. Men are expected to do. We can just fend for ourselves in the North Atlantic Ocean.
But even at that, like getting in a lifeboat doesn't necessarily mean you're going to live either. You're also in the middle of nowhere.
It's a tough. It's you're not out of the woods.
Not at all.
You have survived immediately. But so we're getting to 2 a.m. now, and any boat that will be launched is gone. There is still a couple of collapsibles on Lighthouler's side, but we're getting to the end. It's at this point that the bow of the ship dips below the waterline, and it's now when water starts rushing over that, the ship really starts to tilt now.
Yeah.
So the ship is starting to sink faster and faster. And unfortunately, from this point onwards, most of what we know about the Titanic is kind of myth and legend. And there's 2 very good reasons for that. First of all, I was saying it was panic is building. It's chaos at this stage. It is chaos. Yeah. And there's about 1,500 people left on the boat. About 10 of them are going to survive to tell the tale. So there's very few eyewitnesses to confirm or corroborate anything. There is reports that one officer has had to shoot someone to stop them storming a boat. And legend says this is Murdoch. This is depicted in the film.
Yeah.
It's disputed. Murdoch obviously didn't live to tell the tale. The filmmakers they didn't apologise, but they made a donation to his school.
Yeah, I read that I think they didn't apologise because I think that would admit liability.
Yes, there's kind of a fudge where they don't admit they're wrong, but they pay as if they're wrong.
Imagine that you're doing your absolute best to save as many people as possible, and you're remembered for not shooting someone. Well, apparently shooting someone. Jesus. So
we're at the very end now. Captain Smith, he has kind of done a tour of the deck, and he's essentially relieved the crew. So there becomes a point in every sinking where you're no longer expected to help. It's every man for himself. Yeah. Now, Lighthouler is still trying to launch a collapsible boat. And this is amazing what happened. He's hit by a wave up on the deck. He gets washed down into a sort of shaft and is trapped by a grate and is going to drown. But as the ship is sinking, when ships sink, there's water and there's air trapped in the ship kind of, for want of a better word, burps.
Yeah.
It burps Lighthouler out through a wall.
God.
And he swims up and gets on a boat. And he's the one that will remark later that the water is so cold, it's like being stabbed by 1,000 knives. That's the quote that's actually given to Jack in the film.
Yes, yeah.
So now we're at full chaos. There is no more boats. There's no more way off the ship. It's starting to tilt and tilt more and more. Supposedly the band does keep playing until, a couple of minutes before the ship dips down. They allegedly played Nearer My God to Thee, which is kind of a funeral song. Again, I don't know how true that is. There's a priest taking confessions. The funnels, the chimneys, they're collapsing. We're at 2:15 a.m. The light flickers before finally going out.
That was another thing. Wasn't there people down there the whole time?
Yeah,
just trying to keep lights on.
The guys in the radio room they're trying to send messages until the very end. The messages aren't going anywhere, but they're trying. So what's happened now is the front of the ship is full of water, and that's trying to sink. The stern of the ship, nautical terms.
The arse of the ship.
The arse of the ship, the back of the ship. That's full of air. So that's trying to stay up. The pressure is building and building and building, and the hull essentially cracks.
Yeah.
Splits. The bow starts to sink down, and the stern settles for a minute or two before kind of being pulled vertical, and eventually it sinks. 2:20, about 2 hours and 40 minutes after they hit the iceberg.
Which you would think isn't a lot of time, which it isn't. But when you also think there's ships like the Empress of Ireland, which I think had a similar crash where half it was, it was basically torn open like a tin can, and it was down in 15 minutes.
Yeah, the Lusitania sank in like 20 minutes or something.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's
like, in fairness, of such a bad situation, they had a lot of time. Well, for lack of a better word.
Unfortunately, we're not out of the woods. No. So one of the thing that I think most of the survivors report is the worst aspect of the whole thing. It's the noise. So the vast majority of the passengers on Titanic don't drown. They've got life jackets. They're on kind of makeshift rafts. They're screaming for help. The water is so cold, they cannot survive in it for more than about 15, 20 minutes. And this is kind of this screaming and how it starts to slowly die out is kind of seen as one of the most horrific. It's the thing a lot of the survivors say they can't get out of their heads. Of course, yeah. You know, the lifeboats are reluctant to go back. A lot of them have gone quite a distance away from the Titanic because they know when she goes down, she's going to create a wash that could topple them or drag them down. Yeah. And then also they're just, I suppose, understandably reluctant to go back in case they get swamped by survivors.
But even just to really dumb it down, when we were in Clara Lara as kids, and like that, you might be on an inflatable boat and someone tries to get into your boat, you all end up in the water.
And
that's in a lake in Wicklow. When you're in 2-degree water, in the middle of the Atlantic, you're not going to take that risk. And as much as everyone would, I'm assuming, say what they would go back, the risk is massive.
Yeah, it's very. I mean, I think that's one of the most important things when you're reading about any history, but particularly an emergency. You know, it's very easy to, in the cold light of day, judge the actions of someone. But they're in a very, very stressful situation. You know, it's very hard to make every decision right. Now, one lifeboat number 14, fifth officer Lowe, he mounts a bit of a rescue. He does, though, and he says this himself, this is a direct quote from him, he waited until some of the dead people had thinned out before he went back.
I think is totally logical.
It is logical. Totally. It is logical. And what he does is he gets a couple of boats together and he transfers a load of people onto the boats to make an empty boat.
Yeah.
And him and 7 crew go back and they do try and pull a few out. Now, there's different accounts of how many they rescue. From what I read, they rescue 4 people. And included among them is actually a Chinese firefighter who's a passenger, and he is floating on a door. And many people believe that's where James Cameron took Kate Winslet's.
Fun fact about that. It's not a door they're on.
Yeah, it's a bit of paneling, isn't it?
Paneling.
Yeah.
That drives me insane. It's not even in the shape of a door. You cannot see a door, and that drives me nuts. Sorry. But that poor man, he probably wasn't a door.
Yeah, I mean, you know, he probably didn't mind.
And also, they didn't both fit. They both would have.
No, they didn't. But I mean, I don't particularly like that film, so. But, well, I like the last hour. The first 2 hours, like Notting Hill on a boat. But anyway, I think that the film gets good when the chaos ramps up. So the passengers float there until about 4 a.m, and Carpathia arrives. They rescue 710 people. They're brought to New York. Carpathia was actually heading the other way. It was heading towards Croatia. 1,514 approximately have died. Now, there's only ever going to be 330 bodies recovered. So the vast majority are lost forever to the sea. Survivors are overwhelmingly women. So 82% of the male passengers die. And gender is a much bigger determinant of survival than class. So the immediate legacy of this sinking is enormous. From here on out, all the radios have to be manned 24/7 on a boat, and an emergency message has to take priority over a personal message. Obviously, from here on out, there's enough lifeboats for everyone on board, and the drills are done regularly on them. An organisation is set up to monitor the large icebergs. Shipping lanes are moved further south. So now, when it comes to apportioning blame, a few people do get singled out. Stanley Lord, the captain of the Californian, as I mentioned earlier, he gets criticised for not investigating the fireworks.
Yeah.
Captain Smith is also criticised. It's a bone of contention for some people. Like, the film portrays Smith kind of becoming frozen. He doesn't really do anything. Some people have reported that, whereas other people say, no, he was on the megaphone. It's hard to know.
But I think it's just like anything. You'd have to have seen everything firsthand, which you never will.
No. And as experienced as Captain Smith is, he's never actually experienced a full-on emergency in his entire career. So he's new to it as well.
Exactly, which should obviously as well give him a confidence the whole time to, like, that power on. There's never been an issue before. Anyway, continue.
Whilst there's a few people criticised, the conclusion is, and I think most people would agree with this, that it was most of the people that were doing anything were following regulations, and it's the regulations themselves that are at fault. The kind of conclusion is that this was always going to happen, just happened to happen with Titanic.
And it was the perfect storm.
Perfect storm. Unusual conditions. It just happened to be the unsinkable ship on its maiden voyage that ran into it. Yeah,
the unsinkable ship, maiden voyage. They told the other ship to shut up, seal their own fate there. Like, there's so many variables. If one thing had gone right,
which is
it's just
like
anything.
Most disasters.
Yeah, exactly.
True in most disasters, and you learn, much like modern aviation, you learn from disasters. So there's huge survivor guilt for the survivors. An awful lot of the survivors have lost their husbands or fathers. There's an awful lot of broken families. There's an awful lot of suicide in the years that follow. Bruce Ismay in particular just becomes an absolute shell of a man. He's racked with guilt. Titanic itself, a lot of people think it's going to be lost forever, and it is for almost 74 years. Robert Ballard found it in 1985.
Yes.
It is over 12,000 feet down.
Wasn't that 3 miles or something?
Yeah, it's a massive distance down. It's in two pieces, about 600 metres apart, and it's very steadily decaying. It's essentially being rusted away. So they reckon in maybe 100, 200 years' time, the biggest ship of its time is just going to be a stain on the ocean floor.
That's it. Only recently enough, one of the rails actually fell off.
That's right, front railing, yeah.
So, it's very steadily happening. But it was, even the water down there, it's not rust that's getting it, it's bacteria.
Rusticles, they're called, yeah. So it is and it isn't rust. I mean, we're getting into real chemistry here now, but yeah, it is decaying. There's really nothing we can do about that. There's no real way it can be salvaged, and I don't think there's any want to salvage it. It is a grave after all. And
I do believe they want to try to get the Marconi out of it, but I don't even know if they've even found it or...
Well, yeah, and they're probably trying to discourage, people who don't know what they're doing going down there after recent events.
Absolutely, yeah. Fun fact, actually, about the staircase. When they finally did go down into the Titanic and they went to find the staircase had just been eaten away. It was gone.
Really?
There was no trace. I think they reckon it actually broke loose and floated away.
Yeah, I heard that the staircase might have gone through the dome.
Yeah, that probably is what happened. But there is a haunted house in Wexford in Ireland, and there's the makers of the staircase of the Titanic made the exact same staircase in this house in Wexford, and the house went derelict for years, and there was actually
an iceberg.
It hit an iceberg, and well, essentially the staircase was under weather, like the roof above the staircase was gone, so the staircase was pretty much actually underwater for years and years and years. And when the house got restored, the staircase was absolutely perfect from all the waxes and sealants and everything that was put on it.
Oh, wow.
It was, I actually saw it and everything. It's bang on. It looks perfect. So maybe the staircase just floated around.
Maybe somebody found it. Maybe it's in a Norwegian fisherman's house somewhere or something. Doesn't know. Never heard of the Titanic. Anyway, that's it. That's the story of the Titanic. I think that's all that's left to say is if you please like, subscribe and follow. And
follow us on YouTube as well.
And follow us on YouTube. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you.